Hi, I'm Laura Nelkin. Welcome to Clue 1 of the Cowl Mystery Knit Along. This is your first OWL 2. You know, I've been waiting to say that for quite some time here. I am really excited to share this first clue with you. It has been a bit since I've done a mystery knit along. I have learned over the years what bits to share and what bits that you all can share with each other. It is a great idea for me to remind you that if you have questions, you can ask them below this video, or you can ask them over in the Ravelry threads or over in our Facebook group. I would say the Ravelry threads, if you use Ravelry, are the place that you will get answers the most quickly and get tips and tricks from other knitters as they are knitting the first clue. So I urge you to bop over there as you start knitting if you have any questions. I am really excited to get knitting clue 1 with you, and there are a few things that I want to go over to make sure that you have success with this clue. 1, I have assumed that you have already chosen your yarn, you have wound your yarn, and you have done a gauge swatch. If you haven't done that yet, if you are finding out about this mystery knit along and we're already off and running, there is a separate video that I will link below that will give you all of the information that you need to get yourself ready for this clue. I'm not going to go over that stuff again in this clue because that would be boring. And who wants to be bored? This is exciting stuff. So the first thing I want to do is talk to you about your yarn a little bit, and let's do that now. All right, yarn. We love talking about yarn. Now, I know many of you bought kits for working cOWL MCAL, and some of you are working from stash. If you are working from stash and you're working from mini skeins, your mini skeins want to be about 49 yards each. You're going to be using up each mini skein and then transitioning over to the next mini skein. So if you are working with like a different number of mini skeins, they should equal 250 yards total. So you want to kind of break them up so that you're using that much yarn by the end of the cowl. If you have any questions about that, let me know. Next, if you're working with mini skeins, you want to work with the mini skeins so that the mini skein with the most contrast to your main color is the 5th mini skein. So you're going to use your first mini skein with the one that has the least amount of contrast. You can decide what order you want those mini skeins to go in. For clue number 1, you're going to be using the main color and the first 2 mini skeins. So that's what we're going to be working with contrast color 1, contrast color 2, and the main color. So just make sure to choose and decide which one you like best for 5, which one has the most contrast, and then you're going to start with the other end of your mini skein gradient, starting with number 1. Okay. Once you have gotten your yarn all ready to go, you have decided what is your contrast color 1 and your contrast color 2, we're going to talk about magic knots a little bit. Okay, as you use up each one of your mini skeins, you are going to be tying on your next mini skein. I don't tell you exactly where this happens in the pattern because it could be a little bit different for everybody. When you run out of your first mini skein, you kind of have 2 options. One is to get to the end of a round, give yourself about a 4-inch tail, tie on your next mini skein, and then continue to work with the next color. Don't worry too much if you're starting like a stitch in or a stitch before the end of the round. You could just be around the beginning of the round. Now, I noticed that some of my testers actually just had their transition happen in the middle of the round, and it looks great. So if you want to use absolutely all of your first mini skein up before you tie on your next mini skein, you are welcome to do that. If you don't like magic knots or you are worried about them failing on on you. Another choice that you have is to leave yourself a 6-inch tail and weave in ends afterwards. That is completely up to you which you decide to do. I used magic knots in mine. When I switched over from my mini skeins, from my contrast colors to my main color, I also used a magic knot. And when I did that, I ended 4 stitches before the end of the round. And then I gave myself a 4-inch tail. I tied on the main color and I started working with the main color, not getting too upset about exactly where I started. But if you give yourself that 4-inch tail and you end 4 stitches before the end of the round, you're going to be okay. As you get into this, you are going to notice that the body of the pieces that you're knitting are going to be knit in the contrast colors, and then the main color becomes kind of your border that pulls everything together. I try not to say too much at the beginning of these clues because I know you want to start to see things build on your needle to see what is happening with this mystery. So before we move on to the knitting, I want to remind you to test your magic knots if you are using them. You don't want a magic knot to fail when you go to block this or at some point down the line. So make sure that you've worked them right before you go to start knitting, okay? Promise me you'll do that. I just realized I forgot to tell you I have a completely separate video on how to work a magic knot if you have never worked one before. And that link will be below this video and also in the tips and tricks thread on Ravelry. Okay, let's jump into some knitting. All right, we are starting the feather square together. And the feather square is worked from the inside out, and it starts with a circular cast on. One thing I want to say about this video is you do not need to watch it all the way through if you don't want any techniques kind of spoiled before you get to them in the mystery, so you can kind of watch as you're knitting and come back to this. We'll have it time stamped below to help you jump around to find the techniques that you need. I'm going to do a circular cast on with you quickly, but I do have a deep dive video that does kind of like a slow explanation of how to do a circular cast on. So if you haven't started a project like this before, you might want to watch that video. I'll certainly link it below for you. If you have a hard time with it, I always suggest trying with bigger yarn and bigger needles. This is a cast on I use a lot at the top of hats for modular pieces. You might have used it before and not realized you've used it, but it's one of my favorite cast ons, particularly for mystery knit-alongs. So I have my first mini skein down here, my contrast color 1, and I'm going to take the end of it and I'm going to make a circle right here. And then I'm going to kind of lay down that circle with that little knot on the side. And I'm going to grab 1 double pointed needle. Now I'm going to do this cast on with 4 double pointed needles using a 5th needle as my working needle. You can also work it with 3 double pointed needles and use a 4th one, or you can use magic loop if you like to work magic loop. Now I'm going to go underneath my working yarn with my needle, and that counts as 1 stitch on my needle. And I'm going to dive down in between the circle and grab my yarn and bring it up. And now I have 2 stitches on my needle. And I'm going to continue on like that until I have 8 stitches on my needle. And now I've got 8 stitches on this 1 needle right here. And now I'm going to come down here to the tail, and I am going to pull that tail down, kind of tightening up all of those stitches. And then I'm going to take them and I'm going to slide them to the other end of my needle. And now I'm going to knit 1 row. And you can knit 1 row and start to separate your stitches onto your needles, or you can knit the entire row and then separate out the stitches onto your 4 needles. And I'm going to do that because I just think it's a little bit easier to kind of have a base of one row of knitting before we go to separate those stitches and join them into the round. So now that I've done that, I am going to get all set up, and I'm sliding my stitches to the other end of the needle, and I'm taking 2 stitches and I'm putting them onto one needle, and I'm taking 2 stitches and I'm putting them onto the next needle, and I'm taking 2 stitches and then putting them onto a third needle, and then those last 2 stitches I'm going to leave on that needle. And if I kind of make sure this is centered so you can all see it, and I manipulate my stitches there, you can see already kind of see a square developing from that circular cast on. This is my working yarn right here. So the first stitch that I'm going to knit is onto this needle right here. And what I like to do at this point is place a removable stitch marker so that I know where the beginning of the round is, because it's very hard to use a marker on the end of this needle right here, because you will find that it'll just come sliding right off and you'll have no idea which needle is the first needle of the round. So once you have that all set up, I am going to knit one, yarn over, knit one into the first needle. This is a bit like knitting with an octopus, and you will find that it is much easier to work if you start doing this at a table or on a pillow. It's very hard to do in the air. I'm repeating this 4 times around the knit one, yarn over, knit one time on each needle. And once you get through, like I would say round 1 or 2, you will find that your stitches really start to get developed, and it will be easier to see what is going on. Let's see here. I'm on my last needle. Yay! I like to get my end of the round out, my yarn out of the way so I'm not knitting with my tail again. Knit one, yarn over, knit one. And now I'm back at the beginning of the round, and you can already see, if I place that down for a second, get my tail out of the way, that I'm really developing the center of the square right there. And now I'm on round 2, and I'm just going to knit around just the same way. So I'm going to knit across the first needle, knit across the second needle, knit across the third needle, and knit across the fourth needle all the way around. Now, if you are working magic loop when you do this, you will put needles 1 and 2, so 2 sides will be on one half of your needle and 2 sides will be on the other half of your needle, and you'll use a stitch marker to separate those 2 sides. So that is another option for working this. So I am going to jump ahead and show you this up to round 10 so you get an idea of what it is looking like before we go to do the feather stitch. Okay, here I am through round 10, and you can see that I've actually already tied in and finished off the center of my square just so that tail doesn't keep messing with me while I show you how to work the feather stitch. And you really get an idea of what your knitting should look like. It gets much easier to work when you get to this point. So just kind of power through those first few rounds and it will start to really take shape. So I am on round 11 right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm on needle 1. So I'm going to knit 1, yarn over, and then knit 4. And then I'm to the really fun feather stitch. And we are going to do that together. So this center stitch right here is where the feather stitch happens. So if you're going to work your feather stitch and you're not at the very center of your side, you know that something is off with your knitting. And what I'm going to do right now is count down 7 rows from the first stitch on the needle. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then I'm going to go into that hole right here. That is the 7th row I counted down. And then I've got my working yarn at the back of my work right there, and I'm going to grab that working yarn, but you're going to see that I'm grabbing the working yarn so the left leg of the working yarn is coming over the needle. If this was like a traditional knit stitch, you'd have the right leg of the yarn going being at the front of the needle, but I've got that left leg right there, and I'm going to continue to pick up stitches just that way, where I'm coming over the needle and pulling that strand through and pulling it up. And now I'm going to continue to work that 4 more times, each time going into the hole above the hole I was in the last time. So then I'm picking up that stitch like that. I'm picking it up exactly the same way, wrapping it around. You can see I'm really kind of pulling them up so that those strands get long, and then I'm wrapping it around and pulling it up, and I should have 6 loops that I've just picked up on my needle, and then I'm going to knit the 7th stitch, and then finally what I'm going to do to finish the feather stitch is pick up each of those strands one by one and lift them over the other strands, making a little feather. Now, if you want your little feather to be poofy, the trick to that is really picking up big loops and pulling up a big loop as you do that. If your loops are small and kind of puny, your feather is going to be kind of tight, and that's fine. But what I would suggest as you work your feathers is to work them in a similar way all the way around. So you might find that you want to practice this once or twice to really get your feather to be poofy and lovely, just like that. And then once you have finished that feather, you are going to continue on to the end of the row and then repeat that knit 1, yarn over, knit 4, feather stitch, knit 4, yarn over, knit 1, 3 more times all the way around your square, and then you are going to continue on. Now, around round 16 is when you will find that you start to have a lot of stitches on your needle, and you'll have enough stitches on your needle that needles that if you want to switch over to a circular needle instead of working on double pointed needles, you can switch over to a circular needle. Just make sure that you use a stitch marker for the beginning of your round so that you know where you are at the beginning of your round. I would also suggest placing stitch markers in between each needle so that each quadrant or side is separated by a stitch marker. So once you make it through, let's see, I guess it's round 23 of your square, then you are going to magic knot on your main color and work 2 rounds with your main color. And I want to show you what that looks like on your needles so that you are set up and ready to start working the hexi. All right, here's where things get a little funky and fun. It is time to take your stitches and put them onto some Stitch Saver or scrap yarn so that you will have them available to work with later. You're going to be setting this square aside and not worrying about it for a tiny bit. So Stitch Saver is hollow silicone tubing. I suggested that you purchase that for the knit along. If you don't have it, you can also do this with a tapestry needle and some scrap yarn. I have finished working my little mini square here. I have worked my 2 rounds with my main color, and now I am going to take the next 50 stitches and put them on to a piece of Stitch Saver. I've got that long tail that the directions have you cut hanging right here to the right. And this is the first needle of the round, and this is the last needle of the round. So I'm going to take the first 50 stitches, which for me is actually 22 stitches, because I have just 11 stitches per side. And I'm going to take all of those and then put them on to my Stitch Saver. And now I am going to leave the next 22 stitch, sorry, the next 11, or for you it's 25 stitches on my needle, and I'm going to take these last, let's kind of get this neater right here, this last needle or 25 stitches and put them onto the other end of my stitch saver right there. So all of those stitches are held on stitch saver right there. And these stitches are live and left on the needle. My tail is hanging right here. So to remind you, this is needle 1, needle 2, needle 3, and needle 4, quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. So that is your little feather square right there, all ready to wait till the end of clue 1 to be used again. So one thing that I'm going to do right now that I just thought would be fun to show you while we're here is if the tail of at the beginning of your clue 1 of your square is bugging you and you want to kind of weave it in now so you don't have to worry about weaving it in later, you can take a tapestry needle and just kind of go into every stitch all the way around. And I like to go through kind of once or twice right there, and I start to split threads in the middle just to kind of make sure it's woven in nicely. And then I'll take it and kind of push it, splitting some threads to the back of my work so that it is wound nice and tight. And once I'm sure that it is woven in well, I can then take my scissors and cut that, and I have woven in that end so that my square is looking really nice and tidy and ready to set aside. So the next thing is going to be to talk about that hexi. Let's do that next. Okay, it's time for your owl 2 with your hexi. Are you ready to go for this? This is really fun to do. This is my favorite cast on lately, which is a provisional cast on onto Stitch Saver. I have a separate video that goes over how to do this in depth, so you might want to go ahead and watch that if you haven't watched it before. One thing I will say is I also have a video that kind of does a deep dive into multiple styles of provisional cast-ons. So if you don't have Stitch Saver or a spare interchangeable cord that you can do this onto, then you might want to use scrap yarn and do a provisional crochet cast on with scrap yarn, and then work one row with your working yarn. And if you do that, you're going to want to knit that one row with your working yarn before you go to jump into the instructions that are written in the pattern. So if you have questions about that, if you're working with scrap yarn, feel free to ask me and I will explain that further. Okay, let's go over this provisional cast on. You're going to start with a slip knot that you put onto your stitch saver, and it's pretty important that you leave yourself at least a 40-inch tail when you go to make that slip knot. It's an important step to the mystery knit along, and you're going to regret it if you don't follow that direction in the pattern. So I've given myself a nice long tail, and then I've taken a slip knot and I've put it on to my stitch saver. This slip knot does not count as a stitch. It will be taken off later. And now I'm going to go ahead and start the provisional cast on. I'll just kind of move that out of the way. And I'll start by putting my working yarn over my needle. You'll be working with needle B right now, which is your 24-inch needle. And that counts as my first stitch. And now I'm going to dive down under the stitch saver and grab my working yarn, and that is 2 stitches. Now the pattern has you casting on 25 stitches like this and then placing a stitch marker, and I'm going to only cast on 11 stitches, but I want to show you a trick with that because this cast on is worked in pairs and it's much easier to work when you work it in pairs. So if I count back right now on my needles, I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, 12 stitches on my needle. I'm just going to pinch underneath and slip that one stitch off right there and then grab a stitch marker and put that stitch back on. So that is my first stitch of my next section. And I'm going to continue on. You'd be casting on 25. I'm going to do 11 for you. And when I get to the end of this set, I will have 11, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then I will place another stitch marker. Again, you'll be doing that with 25 stitches, not 11 stitches. And if this is a new cast on to you, go ahead and watch that knit tip. You can practice it a few times. What this is doing is making it so that you have live stitches right here that you're going to be able to go back to later in the pattern. So once you've got your provisional cast on done and you have worked your setup rows, let's talk a little bit more about the Hexi. Okay, let's look at what's on my needles. I am at the end of the setup row and I have purled all the way across my stitches, and now I'm ready to join into the round. So I'm going to go grab a stitch marker. You know, I got one of my little friendly owl guys here, and I am going to put him on, and then I'm going to work setup round 1, which is a knit round. And I'm going to be working around, knitting all the way around with my main color. And then when I come to the end of this round, I'm going to cut my main color and begin to work with my mini skein. If you still have mini skein left from your first mini skein, that is what you're going to be starting with. Everybody should still be working with their first mini skein when they start to work this Hexi. If you used up all of your first mini skein on the square, that means your gauge is very, very off, and you should reach out to me and we'll figure out what is going on. We'll talk about yardages and things like that in the Ravelry group. So now I'm just working around with the main color, and then I will cut my yarn, attach my contrast color, and begin to work the Hexi. What you're going to notice about the Hexi is that those stitch markers are separating your 6 sides, and every time that you have a direction in the pattern, you are repeating that 6 times around, and your Hexi sides are going to be decreasing in towards the center. So whereas with the square, you had increases happening for every quadrant and you were increasing out, now you are decreasing in. So one of the things that I love about this pattern is it kind of does a shallow deep dive, if you will, into shaping and construction, which is really fun. And it's kind of fun to think about your stitches going inside out and your stitches going outside in, like a little nest. I want to show you what this looks like on your needles as you're really deep into your Hexi. And I have a little mini version right here on the needles that I just want to finish up with you so that you can see what it's like to finish your Hexi. And as my stitches got more and more crowded on my needles, I switched over to double pointed needles, and I used a stitch marker to separate the sides of my Hexi, and I just have 2 sides on a needle separated by a stitch marker. And I'm gonna, let's see, what round am I on? I am on round 25. That is a purl 2 together around. So I'm actually on the last round here, so I can show you what it's like to finish off the Hexi. And what I'm going to be doing is purling 2 around. And at this point, I can actually get rid of my stitch markers as I go around, and I'm going to purl 2 together there, and then I am going to switch over to here, and I'm going to bring my yarn to the front of my work, and I'm going to purl 2 together here, And I'm going to purl 2 together here. And then I'm going to remove that last stitch marker. And I'm going to purl 2 together, my last 2 stitches. And now if I kind of put everything down for a second, you can see that I have 6 stitches left on my needles. I am going to cut my working yarn, giving myself about a 6-inch tail. I am going to thread that onto a tapestry needle, and then I'm going to go ahead and get all of these stitches. That is not a stitch right there. And I'm going to thread them through with the tapestry needle, take out my double pointed needle as I go around. Take out, and then I will be able to pull up nice and tight right there at the center of my hexie. And now I can go ahead and finish off the center of my hexie just like I showed you how to do on the square by going back through all of those stitches once or twice. A bent tip tapestry needle is really helpful when you go to do this. And then kind of split your yarns a little bit, go towards the back of your work, and then you can maybe weave it in once or twice more just to make sure it's really caught up and in there, but not showing from the front of your work. And then you can go ahead and cut that, and it is finished and done. And I really love to do that while I'm working these, so I just have less yarns in my way. So you can see this is a little mini hexie of the feather for clue 1. So the next thing that we're going to do together is look at the instructions and talk about something very, very fun, a graft. All right, it is time to get grafting together. I love this graft. I've used it in a few designs in the past, and I'm so excited to do it with you. You can see that I have my little mini hexie that I have knit here under the camera, and we're going to go ahead and take the first 25 stitches and put those stitches onto your needle. If you read the pattern, it reminds you that this first stitch right here is your slip knot from the beginning of the provisional cast on. So you're going to go ahead and want to take that off of the stitch saver and drop it because it does not count as a stitch. And now what I'm going to do with my long tail right here, I'm going to go ahead and take 11 stitches. For me, it's 25 for you. And I'm going to put them onto my needle. As we put those stitches onto my needle, let's go ahead and start to slide them. You might find after we get them on the needle that we need to reorient them. So we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and one more is 11. So I've got 11 stitches onto my needle, and the rest of these stitches you're going to want to leave on your hexie. Now, if you have like a little end stopper, you can take the ends of your stitch saver and use that little like cable tie. You can also use a toothpick. You can tie it in a knot. If you're worried about your stitch saver coming out, there's a few different things that you can use to secure it. And once I get those stitches onto my needle and I've got my long tail hanging right here, what I'm going to do is take these stitches and put them onto another needle, just reorienting them. When you work that provisional cast on, you'll find that every other stitch is oriented with the left leg to the front of the needle. So now all of those stitches are reoriented and ready to go. And now what we're going to do is go grab our square. And we're going to hold the 25 stitches from the hexie, and the 25 stitches from the feather square with the wrong sides held together and the right side of the hexi facing me. In any parts of my video, I know you're watching my video, but make sure that you're reading along with the pattern to make sure that you're doing it correctly. I am going to hold those 2 needles parallel to each other, and then I'm going to grab a 3rd needle, and I'm going to knit 1 stitch from the 1st needle together with 1 stitch from the 2nd needle. And I'm going to do that all the way across. Now, if you've worked a 3 needle bind off, this is going to feel very, very similar. The difference is that you are not passing that slip stitch over as you work this. So I'm working all the way across. You will end up with 25 stitches on 1 needle. I should have 11 stitches on that needle right there. And now I get to grab my tapestry needle and thread that long tail onto my tapestry needle. And this is where the magic happens. Some of you might be familiar with this graft, some of you might not. I'm going to go ahead and with my needle, tapestry needle, go into those stitches on the needle and slide them off onto the tapestry needle and onto that end of yarn. So now I have no more stitches on my needle, and what I'm going to do is pull that needle all the way through, but I'm not going to pull super, super tight down here. I'm going to leave things kind of loose because you want that graft not to pull up on each side, but to block out. So you can see I'm kind of pulling this way and pulling this way. I originally learned this graft when I took a Shetland lace class with Ann Yunson. I don't know the exact name for it. I have heard it called the Betsy join before. I believe it's used in Shetland lace shawls to graft together different sections of shawls. I've used it in a few different designs over the years, but I've really been wanting to use it in a mystery knit along, and I'm glad that I finally did. So now you are done with clue number 1. I wouldn't weave in any more ends at this point. You definitely don't want to weave in that long tail that is on your square. You're going to be using that later. And then, sorry, that's hanging down right over here. And then you could weave in this end, but I would wait to do that until after blocking. And what you're going to do with clue 1 is set it aside, and then you're going to find another cowl to knit, or maybe you're going to cast on for another one of these while you wait for clue number 2 to come out on October 20th. I hope that you're having a hoot with this. It is fun to teach you so many techniques so quickly with a mystery knit along. I promise that you're going to get to practice a few of them once or twice more. Happy knitting. I want to tell them one more thing. Can I tell you one more thing, everybody? Don't forget about the Ravelry threads if you have any questions at all, and know to read your pattern as you are following these videos. It's very important to work with them together.